Hope everybody's breakout sessions this morning were good. Happy to see you all back here for lunch with CDWG presenting Unleashing AI in Public Sector. Corey.
Thank you. Mic check? All right, cool. We're hot. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. As Mr. Kipling so nicely introduced me, my name's Corey Bannerman, and I'm a field CTO with CDW. I'm part of a services group within CDW called Digital Velocity. We focus on a number of cutting-edge services. I'm sure a lot of you think, CDW, wait a minute, aren't we fulfillment and reseller? Well, over the last 5-7 years, we spent a couple $1 billion acquiring SIs, MSPs, and brought in some really great capabilities over the last couple of years. So came in to kind of lead the charge in bringing those often developed in high-end federal or commercial capabilities into state and local education. So I cover those areas for the country and get to see a lot of cool stuff and come out and talk to audiences like yourself. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about AI, and I know this is a hot topic for everybody, so let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit of a kind of perfect graphic for the current state of this conversation. It's both super hot, and everybody wants to talk about it, and every conference I go to, this is one of the key keynotes or panels that we're talking about is AI, and at the same time, it seems like a lot of us are kind of just sitting there with the hot conversation going around, wondering what we should be doing with it, right? One of the most common questions I get at panels and Q&As and presentations like this is, as a leader in government IT, what should I be doing to make sure this is used effectively, but also protect myself? And we're going to talk about a little bit of that today. I do want to offer, please, if anybody has questions or Q&A, I love having interactive sessions. I don't do a ton of slides. I don't have a big long video to show you. I'm mostly going to be talking about experiences I'm seeing with my customers. But if you have questions or use cases or anything you want to talk about during or after the presentation, please come on over. I'd love to talk to you about what we've done as well as what you might be thinking about doing. So with the conversation kind of being on fire, but also a little bit of a mess, and now all of a sudden the average user is aware of these capabilities. I mean, all this stuff's been going on forever, right? I talked to some folks from DeepMind at Google, and they'll tell you there's been some form of artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and these smarter algorithms all the way back to like the 50s, and the military and high-end weapons research and stuff have used it for a long time. So, but it's becoming more accessible to the average user these days. So how do we drive outcomes for government with AI? That's kind of the goal, I think. When I talk to government users, it's generally, we know it's out there, we know we should be having a strategy, maybe building some governance around it, implementing it somewhere, but how do we actually go about doing that, right? So some of the most common use cases and what I call low-hanging fruit, and I'm just going to start out by saying if you're in state and local government, even, and I say this to my federal customers as well, I would not go after the tough, high-hanging fruit early, right? Start with the low-hanging fruit, the low cost, low impact stuff, but high impact to your people's hours, their experience, your customer or citizens' experience. So some of those cases include things like chatbots, right? I joke, I write all kinds of like little briefs for sellers at CDW and in previous jobs around different technologies and how we can sell them, and I feel like maybe 1 out of 10 read it, right? So, but I always joke, if I just took all those briefs I've written and put a chatbot in front of it, everybody would be a selling genius with some of this stuff, because there's something about when you take a wiki or a knowledge base and you put a chatbot in front of it and you make it interactive, where people just tend to get much more value out of it. They can ask the question they're looking for and the chatbot gives it to them. And it's really accessible these days. We just built one in front of one of our internal wikis for some of our architects, and it's been amazing seeing the growth of it and how quickly that chatbot has started to scare me, where it's like, wow, some of my guys aren't quite as needed anymore because of this chatbot. Self-service and call steering, what we call conversational IVR, this is a big one. So I'm sure many of you deal with some form of CCAI or at least call center and virtual call center. most organizations do. Being able to route those calls efficiently, as well as handle the low-hanging fruit calls, right? Get them to the right menus so they can make their quick move. It can lead to a significant drop in number of calls, retries. It can lead to a better constituent or customer experience. So I would say conversational IVR is a big one. If you're not already using CCAI, definitely something to put on your list, because we'll talk about some use cases that we've seen where that's been a big win for different customers. Advanced interactions and automation integration, things like virtual agents, right? So this is kind of right in between the chatbot and the call routing. This is where we have one internally that resets passwords for people. His name's Harold, right? And Harold will ping me and go, hey, I noticed you haven't rebooted your machine in 3 days. Let's reboot it, but by the way, in a week you're gonna need to do your password. Let's update it, right? So having that virtual agent, whether it's for simple things like that or more complicated things, if you have a standard kind of onerous process that your users are already doing, putting a virtual agent in there can lead to some pretty great outcomes in my experience. Some of the other ones that are specifically kind of in this space would include Agent Assist, so enhance your already live agent's ability, right? So we're going to talk about this a little bit. Everyone's always thinking about, how do I use AI to automate the whole thing? That's not necessarily always the best case. In fact, the best use cases I've seen are where we use AI, things like dashboards, assists for humans to basically marry that human and machine intelligence, give them the right info at the right time to save a little bit of time, get a better outcome, and ultimately, give everybody a better experience. And then reporting and monitoring. So a lot of you are already using this and probably don't even realize it. Many of the monitoring and reporting tools that are out there have some form of predictive analytics or, and machine learning. The definition of AI and machine learning has stretched massively over time, right? I remember 10 years ago, nobody even used the word AI unless they were talking about Skynet, right? Like full, singularity, self-aware AI. Now it seems like anything that has an algorithm that is AI, but when you get into some of these reporting, and we're going to talk about one of those use cases, one of my customers we just did a large POC for, when you can marry AI with your reporting and monitoring and give somebody the ability to look at a dashboard and get a very quick view of the situation, it's amazing the amount of time and effort you can save. And we're going to get into that, so I won't hit that one. So challenges, right? Why haven't we seen this blow up faster, right? Like I said, it's been around for a long time, and ChatGPT's new, right? In theory, and these chatbots are a newer thing, but all these other technologies have been around in some form for a long time. Well, a lot of it comes down to undefined strategy. Companies didn't think customers cared enough necessarily to think about it this way. Now, with the explosion of ChatGPT, everybody's talking about how their AI or their predictive analytics is going to improve your experience with their product. So that's a big part of it, is the company strategy that we're offering these things, right? Even Google, if you talk to them about ChatGPT, they'll tell you, we wish they didn't do it almost, and now we've done it with Bard, and we didn't want to let that cat out of the bag necessarily, and it's kind of funny to have that conversation with them. But the point being that there's also your side of it, right? How many of you can honestly say you have your full strategy and governance plan mapped out for all these different kinds of AI that are possible in your organization? Some of you may be way ahead of the curve, right? Where you've already put out a governance plan and you've already explained to your users and your IT staff how you expect these things to be handled, planned, roadmap, delivered, monitored, right? There's a lot of considerations that go into it. But all around, I think, for a long time, there's been a lack of strategic planning around these technologies, even though we all kind of know that they're coming, right? The next thing is data quality and quantity. A big part of what my group does at CDW is large data projects, right? So that's everything from your Informatica and Talend and Snowflake type deployments back over to predictive analytics and AI data, machine learning data use cases. And I can tell you right now, the vast majority of our moneymakers in that practice are actually just cleansing massive piles of data and disparate databases. Very many, lots of organizations have these different pools of data, and it's a mess. There's very rarely a cleansing that's happening pre-moving into something like a Snowflake, an enterprise data warehouse. So often it's kind of, nobody's eating their vegetables, right? So all of a sudden they have to do a crash diet at the end to get into that next level and get that value out of it. So I think that's a big thing that holds organizations back, because it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If any of you play with ChatGPT or Bard, your prompt engineering plays a big impact in how well it answers your question. At the same time, sometimes you can do a great job. I was joking. I was trying to put together, one of the things I do is like a side kind of giving back thing is I work with young men and women coming out of college, or even maybe they're 30 and they're trying to figure out their career path and they're interested in IT, and I try to help them with their resume and this and that. And one of the things I always end up doing is explaining my path through technology. And so I was trying to write up like a quick brief using ChatGPT, so it was like a one-pager of here's my story, and I kept hallucinating and adding in all these details that were just not given to it. And I'd tell it, hey, just stick with what I gave you. Like I gave you a ton, and we're just trying to write a one-pager here, and all of a sudden it's throwing in 20 million there, and vice president of sales over here, and I'm like, okay. So even if you give it good data, it can often hallucinate and have issues. But the quality of the data is really important, especially when you're talking about some of the use cases we're going to get into here in a minute. The next one being ethical considerations, especially in government. My favorite question I've ever been asked about this is, if I give any of this decision-making power to an AI and somebody dies, who's responsible at that point, right? If a government worker makes a decision that leads to a tort or an injury of a citizen, there's recourse, and there's a playbook for that. I think we're in a weird spot with these AIs when you get to things like that. When you even just get to ethical considerations around selection or decision making. One of the big use case I'm going to talk about in depth here in a minute, a lot of it has to do with issuing licenses, right? And how do we decide whether or not to issue a license? If we're not very careful, there could be a whole section of people, and it doesn't have to be something that would be obvious. It could be something much less obvious, like an educational thing. You have someone who's been working in hazardous materials for 30 years, but they don't have a bachelor's degree, and somebody ticks the wrong box, and all of a sudden you're denying all these people licenses, right? So we have to be really smart about how we go into this and build a plan to make sure anywhere we're using these technologies, we're doing it appropriately to make sure that we're not, disqualifying certain people. And the last thing is user adoption. If you build it, will they come, right? Like I said, I've written 1 million briefs. How many people have actually read them? If I build a chat bot in front of my wiki, how many people will even know about it? So as much as you need a plan for how you're going to implement it and govern it, you also need a plan for how you're going to roll it out and get that user adoption and grow it, because all of these tools, they get better with age. The more people use them, the better they get. If you're wondering why OpenAI would drop ChatGPT out, it's because we're the product there. The more we use it, the more data they get, the better the tool gets, right? So anytime you're building a tool like this, you want interaction at the highest level you can. So when you're actually going about adopting it, there's some strategies you can take first, right? First thing, like we said, you can start eating your vegetables 10 years ago. I'm sure many of us didn't, and we have that data mess problem I talked about. But instead of going on the crash diet when someone wants to do an enterprise data warehouse and predictive analytics, one of the things I encourage customers to do is, as a side project, have your DBAs, have your architects. Let's talk about how we can start to cleanse the data, how we can start to make our data more ready for these technologies, because they're coming and it's going to be expected, and we're all going to be expected to deliver on it. So anywhere that we can look at the user experience and our data sprawl and start to cleanse that data and bring it back down, that's going to be a huge benefit for you and your users. And frankly, you have to pick the right data for it as well, right? You don't want to throw in, you need to be very selective about what data you're going to use for these applications, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, we used a tool called Document AI to read handwritten letters as well as typed PDFs as part of the solution we're going to talk about. Initially, when we were doing the POC, the fire department we were working with was like, well, we don't want to, go through the whole legal process to worry about the PII data, so we'll just black it out, right? We'll, like a typical censored document or redacted, we'll just black box it. Read right through it like it was nothing. Literally read every single word on the page, got all the PII data immediately into the model. So that's not going to work. So you got to be really careful about what data you place where and how you're going to go about it. And you got to be really careful about that corner cutting, because if we immediately recognize that, we've remediated it, talked to the legal team, make sure all the NDAs were in place, make sure that we secured the environment. Because think about it, they might have set that environment up as a POC. They don't want to spend $50,000 setting up this highly guardrailed, well set up, secured environment just for a POC, do they? Well, turns out, yeah, if you're going to put PII data in it, you probably should, because black boxes won't work. Next thing is machine learning operations, right? So if you unleash something like this on your team, what level are they going to be comfort-wise in managing it, maintaining it, upgrading it? A lot of this stuff is pretty easy to set up. It's a lot harder to maintain, utilize, and grow. And then those first considerations, the data cleanliness as well as what data is in it, becomes much more important. Once it's in there, you know, it's in there unless you're going to blow it away completely. And keep in mind, again, just like ChatGPT being public and free and barred, and we're basically giving up our data at that point as part of, you know, that's the transaction. You get to use this tool, but we get to use your data for more training. Once it's in there, it's in there. So you really got to be careful about that piece of it. The next thing is making sure that the availability is there, right? So if you build something like this and all of a sudden that's your main point of contact for your users or your citizens, and that's how you're handling this particular use case, what's the availability like, right? What happens if that chatbot goes down that now services 90% of your constituent calls, and you know you happen to have some kind of disaster, and you know city services are having issues and people are calling and the chatbot's not available. So you gotta think about that operationally as well. And so far I've been talking a lot and I haven't seen anybody throw hands up, but again, please feel free to interrupt me. We got plenty of time, and I love sidetracks. So understanding the value and the role of it as well. So a lot of people misunderstand this. They see these tools and they immediately think, how can I peel this banana backwards, right? Like I got a solution looking for a problem. And I always have to tell people, like, let's not do it that way. One thing I learned working at AWS is they have a big mantra around work backwards from the problem, not forwards from the technology, right? So the fire department we're going to talk about, they saw a product and they wanted to use it for different use cases, but they picked one. But immediately, it took me like 3 months to explain to them that like this isn't going to work the way you think it is. And we'll talk about what that difference was and how that went in. But it was very difficult. If anybody's worked with fire departments, they're a lot like the military, right? There's rank, and you can't go to the CTO over the director of and say, listen, man, your director's burning 4 months on you on a POC because he won't listen to me about how this is going to work. It just doesn't work that way. You'll get thrown out of the building for breaking rank. So it's really important that everybody goes into these exercises with the understanding that we're trying to find a solution to a problem, not a use for a solution. Next is how do we define the business value, right? Like you can build all kinds of cool stuff. I've seen people bring, I had a coworker bring me, he basically used AWS, a tool called Textract, which is just like Document AI we're going to talk about, can basically read handwritten, typed documents, whatever, and turns it into a JSON file. And he had created this thing where he would take transcripts from customer calls and turn them into a JSON file. And then he's like, think of all the cool stuff we could do with this. And I'm like, I don't need it. You know what I mean? It just wasn't, I didn't need it at the time. So it's like, what's the business value of what you're building? Now, if it's just learning and practice, great. But if you're spending a lot of time on it, you got to really make sure that we're doing something that's going to impact your citizen experience, your user's experience, or the bottom line, right? Is this going to save us money? Is it going to save us time? Or are we going to burn more time and money trying to implement it and make it work? So some of the key generative AI, so you have a couple different kinds of AI, right? I put predictive analytics and data AI in one category, and then I put what we call CCAI or conversational AI, which is everything, the chatbots, the call routing, all of that in the next category. Then you have generative AI, and generative AI is kind of the one that's led to this kind of dumpster fire that we're all experiencing where everyone hears about AI. You know, I go out and talk to people and they ask me what I do, and I always try to avoid like, well, part of my job is talking about this because next thing you know, I'm talking about Skynet again, right? And you know, is the world going to get taken over by AIs? And but when you do talk to people about this, the one they think about is generative AI. They're not thinking about call routing and chatbots. They're not thinking about, you know, deep data learning and predictive analytics and modeling. They're thinking about an AI that can write a book or write a poem or maybe something that's going to generate an image, right? And that's really kind of become a whole new category that's really blossoming right now. And some of the cool use cases, man, you know, city governments using drones, taking video footage to identify damage on buildings, right, so that they can do maintenance automatically. Using, I mean, I don't want to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm sure more than 50% of this room has used a generative AI at some point to write something that went somewhere and didn't go, hey, by the way, I didn't write that, right? I know I do it. It's a great starting point. I haven't written a block of code without starting with an AI in over a year. I'll admit that to everybody. Why should I start with the blank page, the old war of art, when I could start with the AI, ask it to start the module, start the piece of code, and then I can test and iterate and make it better as I go, right? It's actually really nice, especially for people learning too. I sweat for, I have 2 young sons, 4 and 1, and then I have a girl on the way. And I sweat for, if any of them decide to get into programming, I'm going to teach them early, like, well, start with the AI because your competition definitely will, and the amount of work one developer can get done if they're effectively using these tools is pretty impressive. Versus, you know, I won't go too much into it. If you haven't read The War of Art, though, really good book about how to get past procrastination and, you know, starting with that blank page. How do you start getting some code down, or whether it's a book you're writing or something you're painting, whatever you're doing. So making complex data more accessible, right? So that's one of the things we did with this use case I'm going to talk about. So it doesn't necessarily just mean predictive analytics and dashboards and stuff like that. It could be as simple as, you know, this knowledge worker reads 3 PDFs per applicant to approve this license, right? How do we make that a simpler process? Well, what if we use the AI to read the data, crunch it, make a confidence score. That confidence score dictates whether or not they even open the PDF. Think about the time saving that that alone could actually provide, right? So make that complex data more accessible, save your people time, enhance customer, constituent, or user interaction. Like I said, the chatbot thing, it's amazing how much a chatbot can save you from people making phone calls and wasting 2 or 3 days on getting started with something when they can just ask a chatbot and get a close answer, if not the exact answer they're looking for. We already talked about content generation, but again, like, especially for anybody who has developers out there, you should be encouraging, in my opinion, their use of tools. Like, I mean, ChatGPT and Bard are good, but there's also some tools that are specifically built around generating code. I know there's some groups, or I've seen some leaders in IT who look at it as almost like a cheating, or, oh, well, if I let them do that, it's like, trust me, don't think that way. Do it the other way. It's like, you know, people protested the calculator when it came out. Nobody's going to know how to write out math, right? People still know. But the people who adopted the calculator early were the people who figured out some of the math that powers our world today. And then app integration. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in our use case, but what apps do you have today that you have problems with, and with an integration with an AI or even just another tool could lead to that? So you should be thinking about how to create these custom solutions for your particular use case, right? And the nice thing is with APIs and the way that apps have been developed and changed over the years, we see a lot more of these monolithic legacy kind of what we call sacred cows in our world, right? Where someone built it 20 years ago and we're just keeping the lights on. It's much more common for it to look like Lego bricks, where it's like, yeah, here's our custom app, but we have all these other off-the-shelf apps that we've Lego bricked together to create this solution. And now with these AI tools, you can often integrate that with a couple API calls, load the data back in, and get a really great result. So this one I'm just going to hit quick. This one's more for everybody here, right? We have the strategy, which is a couple of key things here. Does it have a laser pointer on it? Yeah, it does. So we have the use case identification, right? Let's start with the problems, and we're going to talk about how we do that, but I'm not here to pitch you on our services. But I can tell you, as someone who's done a lot of these, we call them user journey workshops. Sit down with the people who do the work and ask them day to day, where are you spending your time? Where is it going well? Where do you like doing what you do? And where do you feel like you could be saving time? And don't worry about the tool or the technology yet. Just collect those user stories of, you know, this knowledge worker or that director or that manager or that, you know, help desk person. Where do you spend your time day to day? And then you look at those, you collect those use cases, and you can start to build basically a stack of use cases that you can then search and figure out what would be the highest impact if we went after an AI solution to help that. The next is doing kind of an assessment of your own readiness, right? Where is our data today? Do we have a governance strategy? Have we even sent an email? Even within CDW, we've had some of our key leaders send out emails around AI, and they're conflicting. It's like one is telling you don't touch this at all, right? And the other one's like, you can kind of use it, and the third one's like, well, don't put any company data in it, but if you don't think people are using it all over the place, you're out of your mind. So where's your current state? Data governance is a big one. I've had multiple people ask me, hey, can you guys just develop like a pre-packaged AI governance package that we could buy? And it's just like, here's my letters to everybody, and here's our governance plan, and here's our adoption plan. I'm actually thinking about it too, so we might put that together. But you need to take your existing data governance strategy. By the way, if you don't have one just for data in general, you should. That's something that we do pretty significantly for customers is create that like 2-year roadmap for getting your arms around your data today, securing it, and building a plan for the future. And then the security and ethics one. This one really is the hardest, guys. You can talk to your peers, you can go online, and you can even try to pay a consultant. But ultimately, a lot of these don't get fixed until 10 years after, once it's already been done, and you find the problems that you didn't think about. So I think the ethics is the hardest one. Next is design. You select your products. Do a POC. Don't go all in on any of these tools until you've sat down and tested it out, made sure it works in your environment to fix the problem. It might not work the way you thought it was going to, like I'm going to talk about here in a minute, but at least make sure it's going to provide the impact you think it is before you go throwing money at it. Next is building, right? So teaching your people to prompt engineer is huge, especially if you do generate a lot of content and you've created this strategy and you've decided, you know what, for the people who put out the press releases for city of or department of, I don't care if they use ChatGPT, as long as when we get down to it, they're not putting our data into OpenAI and they're taking a template and building from it. Well, teach them, do some workshops around that. See who your most effective AI users are and teach the others how to prompt engineer, because I promise this is going to be like a big part of technology workers in the future is who's the best at using these tools. Model selection, this one's a little more in the weeds, but there is options for all of these. So to give you an idea, I talked about Textract and Document AI already. All 3 of the public clouds have an option for this where they can extract text and turn it into JSON. Azure has one as well. Which one's the right one for you, right? And that could be a number of things. Sometimes, we already have a bunch of Microsoft stuff. We have a contract, we have Microsoft services, we have a great Microsoft partner. Well, then maybe, Azure and OpenAI and all those tools are going to be the one to go with. Other times, in education, I see this all the time. Google is the clear option because of the benefits that they give to those education customers. They essentially buy the business, right? Also, it's much simpler, and they're stretched thinner, smaller budgets, fewer people. You want it to be as simple as possible. Then I have customers who need the most range of options and capabilities. Well, AWS is probably going to be the front runner there because they have 300 plus services or something now at this point. When I left, they had 250, and they've already grown 50 more in almost 2 years or something. It's crazy how quickly they develop products. When I worked there, they had a daily newsletter of all the new products, and it was almost every day. It seemed like there was 3-4 major updates to something. So we're going to talk about some use cases really quickly. The first one I've talked about a little bit, so let me just give you the background on this fire department. So this fire department went to a Google event, and I won't say what city. They are cool. They would let me say it, but I'm trying to be respectful of them. But they're a very famous fire department. They're a big deal. They're a leader in their particular state, not just for public safety, but also for all state and local government. And they came to an event, and their CTO saw Document AI and said, I know that has to be able to save me money somewhere. So he put one of his key people in touch with us and the Google team, and we went in and we initially just set up a Google landing zone, an account for them. We set up Document AI. We started loading some of that data in, and I already told you about the first snafu where we tried to black block and it read right through it like it was nothing. But the point was, they had hazardous material licensing issuing, and that was the use case we decided. People are spending 10 to 15 hours, 3 knowledge workers, it's 45 hours a week. If we can get rid of that and nobody has to read PDFs to give these hazardous material license, by the way, they had like a 2% decline rate. So it was very low-hanging fruit, right? They were not worried that they were going to give a hazardous material handling license to the wrong person and someone was going to die. But the idea was, let's start with that, then we can talk about fire permits and other things like that. So what we did was we set up that environment, we loaded a bunch of their examples. So part of their concern was they had handwritten what they called letters of recommendation. So this is where employers would reach out to the fire department, or would send a letter to the fire department along with this person's application, and they were handwritten. 99% of the time. They were never the same format, and often they would be very vague, right? So it wasn't, you know, hey, pick from these 3 qualifications and tell us which ones they have. They would write things like, Ted has 34 years of fire suppression experience. It's like, okay, that's not a very useful metric, and it's not very good data, right? But they had to include that, and they didn't really even have a governance plan around what qualified in those letter of recommendations other than kind of just having one. But they were concerned that we wouldn't even be able to read them with the tools. Well, of course, the tools could read them no matter how badly written they were. The next conversation was they use a tool called Excella. Anybody in here ever seen or used Excella? It's a workflow automation tool, so we got some Excella folks, right? Excella is one part workflow automation, issuing licenses, things like that, one part data warehouse. The problem was, peeling the banana backwards, they wanted a world where they call out to Document AI, they send the data back, and everything gets crunched and, you know, done in Excella. I called the lead developer for Excella and one of their CTOs and sat down with them for a couple hours, and they said, well, we've done this 4 or 5 times for customers as POCs, but it's never within Excella. It was always a third-party developer would develop an applet for us, we'd run it through Google, AWS, Azure, and then we would just feed the answer back in, or we would have the user click. The most advanced they had seen was they had someone develop basically an RPA script that would click the issue button kind of thing for similar use cases. It took me 3 months to convince that fire department project leader that we could not do what they wanted in Excella. So what we did instead was we developed a middleman applet. And initially they wanted it to be fully automated, just issue it. If it's better than this, issue it. And we talked them out of that. They said, hold on, this is the first time you're using this stuff. Let's really test it out. Let's do a dashboard. So what this looks like is instead of a user opening an Excella ticket, having 3 PDFs, opening them, reading each of them, making a decision and clicking issue, decline, or send back to user, I said, let's do a dashboard that comes up with a confidence score. Confidence on how well it extracted from the files, how high the likelihood that you should issue, and then if it needs to, it'll tell you should send it back for more information. It's missing something, right? So we wrote some code that took that JSON and compared. Do the names match? The address matches, right? Are they in New York City residents? They did ID. Sorry. They had an ID there, so we were able to check a database on that and check the ID to make sure that was legitimate as well. So anyways, we did all of that, and it would come out with a confidence score. Should you issue? Should you return? And then can you move forward with it? So that's kind of what the actual use case was there. I'm going to go to the diagram here. This is what it actually looks like. So the documents would get loaded into cloud storage, basically a cloud storage bucket right here. And then they would go into some cloud functions, which would kick off the Document AI reader and then load them into BigQuery. So BigQuery is basically a table that you can then query against and get answers. So we would then query against that, take the outputs, and run additional code against them to compare all of those things. Then we fed those comparison outputs into a dashboard. So that is that particular use case. We kept it kind of simple in this diagram, the custom app code for decision making there, and the user or code initiates the decision, right? So we can actually, after we run this for a while and we decide how accurate it is, that's when we decide, all right, is this something that we move forward with full automation on? A little bit more detail in here. I don't know if they're going to send out these in the background, but so they're extracted from Excella and uploaded. So just to be clear too, that was like the big thing was like we knew we could take data out of Excella, and this is what I mean about these app integrations. It's usually Lego bricks, right? You assume every app that you're going to work with is going to have an API to get things out and to send things in. Doesn't always work that way, unfortunately. In fact, in this case, you could get things out. Excella is great. They have the construct API, they call it. It's great at, hey, give me a pile of data. There is no way to get data back in there unless it's loaded in as like a PDF or handwritten in. So that's why we could never make it where, even if we knew exactly what the answer was, there was no way to, through the APIs Excella had, actually say, go ahead and issue the license. So the best we could do would be write code that would actually, what we call robotic process automation. So literally move a mouse and click issue like a human would. That's the best version of that, at least existing. Now talking to Excella, they're planning on building a roadmap and integrating tools like this because, like I said, they had already done this 5 or 6 times before I even got to them, so I imagine they've done it more since. But just be aware of that. Just because you want it to work that way and you assume it should, sometimes you have to do that research and Unfortunately, some apps are better than others in their documentation. It was not easy to figure out that there was no way that they could do that, and then harder to, prove it to the customer. So that's that use case. I didn't want to spend too much. We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure that I leave a minute here for questions. So I'm going to move through to I already kind of talked about the user journey workshops that we do. So I'm just going to keep it on the slide here and just open it up for a minute. Anybody have questions? Anybody have a use case? Anybody want to add anything? Concerns? Nice. I must have nailed it then, huh? So yeah, I mean, if I'm in government right now and I'm thinking about how I use this, because I'm sure your leaders are asking you, your constituents, your boards, whoever you report to is always asking, hey, how are we using AI? How are we going to do it better? I think the first thing anybody should be doing is building that governance plan. The next thing, do a user journey workshop. You don't need to pay a company like us to do it, even though we'd be happy to help you with it. We have a whole process and folks who do it every day. But sit down with your knowledge workers and try to understand from their perspective. Keep in mind, too, I've seen a lot of customers where they go to build something like this out, but they don't take into account the user's feelings on how that works, right? So they build this whole thing out assuming, oh, this is going to make it so much better and save us all this money. And the user goes, no, you didn't get it. You missed this whole part. That's not going to work, right? So as much as nobody wants to sit down with their users because they're just going to tell you, oh, that won't work because they don't, job protection, et cetera. You'd be surprised how often not sitting down with your users will actually lead to a loss because you don't understand the process the way that they might. So I appreciate everybody's time. I hope this was helpful and a little useful for you. And maybe we'll be back. And I know you've had some of us in the past, so thanks for having me. You've been a gracious audience, and appreciate everybody's time. I'll be around at the booth if anybody has questions or wants to talk about any of their particular use cases. And thanks to all the virtual joins as well.